we are delighted and honored to be joined once again by Professor Joan Mellen of Temple University in Philadelphia. And she, of course, is the author of this landmark study, A Farewell to Justice, and the second edition with 90 pages, I believe, of additional material has appeared and is available. And I would urge people to make this your starting point, or at least a key point of reference in any study you want to do of the Kennedy assassination and related problems. Because as a historian, I would always say the best bet for getting a good analysis of anything is a historical presentation, a genetic history. And here, through her experience and analysis of the Garrison investigation, you get how this problem unfolded itself before the eyes of the world. So, again, very happy to be joined by Joan Mellen. Now, Joan is just back from Dallas, and we want to get her to talk about that. But now, Joan, the one thing after all the stuff we saw, right, there was a CNN special, there were a million specials, CBS had their 4 days of coverage on their website, C-SPAN had days of NBC coverage on C-SPAN. Ultimately, who did this? And as you have said in many appearances, it's the CIA. It's specifically the operations directorate of the CIA. Can you, just as a starting point, a benchmark, to lay down how did this come about? Who did it? In other words, who's the culprit, as best we can tell?
Well, it's a pleasure to hear you again, Webster. I don't know where to start. One of the we really start with Jim Garrison, because when Jim Garrison looked at Oswald in New Orleans and he saw with whom Oswald was associating, he said not only, I think I might have said this on the last program, not only was Oswald not a lone assassin, as the Warren report said, but everyone he was with CIA. More recently, a person who had been, I guess you could call it, involved with a CIA proprietary, said to me that it was a certainty that CIA had foreknowledge of the Kennedy assassination. And that's as far as he would go. So I don't think we can say who was the person whose bright idea this was. And because we don't have that piece, I urge everyone to read Don DeLillo's novel Libra, where DeLillo postulates that among the planners, he has one fictional planner, and he has one person that is a spitting image of David Atlee Phillips, who was in the clandestine services, and whose name appears beginning with, I suppose, the coup in 1954 in Guatemala. So there's a history of CIA overthrows of elected officials, and the same people then turn to what they call the CIA's executive action capability, and they turn it on our own president and the head of state here. I don't think there's any other sponsor of the assassination more obviously connected than CIA, and of course they're involved in the cover-up, and they're really everywhere. When the House Select Committee did its investigation, CIA was looking over their shoulders and informing the committee and the lawyers for the committee what questions they were allowed to ask witnesses and what and what time period they were allowed to cover. And when Gaten Fonzie, who was the chief investigator for the House Select Committee, sat there watching the Bernardo de Torres being deposed, he said to himself, of all the hundreds of thousands of Cubans you would in Florida, you would never have thought why the House Select Committee chose this guy. So heavily sanitized was the interview. Bernardo de Torres, I'll just remind the listeners, was one of the people, the two Cubans who visited Sylvia Odio in September of 1963 with a person named, quote, Leon Oswald. And Bernardo de Torres, who went under the pseudo then of Leopoldo, who then called Sylvia Odio and said, I just really wanted to tell you this Leon Oswald, he keeps talking about how some Cuban should kill President Kennedy because of the Bay of Pigs. And Bernardo de Torres was a veteran of the Bay of Pigs invasion and also was heavily connected to CIA. The documents are available, really. Seems also to show us, just that figure alone, to show us how CIA was so close to the implementation of the assassination.
All right, and just a couple of notes. Now, David Atlee Phillips, readers of my book, The Unauthorized Biography of George H.W. Bush the Elder, they know David Atlee Phillips as the the head of this AFIO, Association of Former Intelligence Operatives, I think, and they're very big in favor of George H.W. Bush back in 1980, 1984.
That's very interesting, Webster, because, of course, after Phillips had retired, quote unquote, from the agency, he set up this organization that you're talking about, this Association of Retired Intelligence Officers,
right.
And it's very fitting. I don't recall that, but it's very fitting that they should protect George H.W. Bush, who had a long history of being an asset of CIA, of lending his operations for CIA uses, just as the person who brought George H.W. Bush to Texas, Neil Mellen, the CEO of Dresser Industries, and that was the first person who employed George H.W. Bush when he moved to Texas, was also using his organization as cover for CIA operatives. So really, they're all, as Don DeLillo says in another novel called Underworld, they're all connected. Everyone is connected.
And I would just point out that my biography of George H.W. Bush, unfortunately not the printed edition where this was censored by the publisher, but what you can find online, I go through George H.W. Bush as one of the prime organizers of the Bay of Pigs attack, and then as somebody who shows up in the address book of George de Mohrenschildt, this white Russian CIA Eastern European.
Now, you know that I wrote a book about George de Mohrenschildt called Our Man in Haiti, and it picks up George de Mohrenschildt's life. It gives a summary of his life and picks up where George de Mohrenschildt bids farewell to Lee Harvey Oswald, his charge in Dallas and Fort Worth, and takes up with Clemar Joseph Charles, a Haitian backer who hoped that CIA would overthrow Papa Doc, Francois Duvalier, and put him in as the president of the Republic of Haiti. And there's de Mohrenschildt. So I trace what de Mohrenschildt was doing in Haiti. People often ask, well, why was de Mohrenschildt in Haiti? And so I called that book Our Man in Haiti, using the Graham Greene locution,
right.
Two Graham Greene locutions. One is, okay, Our Man in Haiti, George de Mohrenschildt, and CIA in the Nightmare Republic, because the Haitians hated that. But Graham Greene wrote a book about Haiti called The Comedians, one of his entertainments, and I got that phrase from there. The nightmare, it was really a nightmare republic during the time of Duvalier.
Well, certainly. But now, concerning de Mohrenschildt, this is also somebody who was liquidated right before he was going to testify to the House Assassinations Committee, I believe.
That's true, Webster, because I found one of my sources on Haiti was a man who had a kenaf plantation. Now, kenaf is a plant that's in place of jute, which makes rope. And his name was Joseph F. Dreyer, Jr., and he got to know everyone, including George de Mohrenschildt in Haiti. So I interviewed Dreyer, and I wanted to talk to him about de Mohrenschildt, and he told me something really remarkable, and that was that the day before de Mohrenschildt's death, George de Mohrenschildt called Dreyer up on the phone. They knew each other from Haiti, and said, let's have lunch. And I have something I want to tell you. I want to talk to you about something. And Dreyer was very busy, said, well, I can't do it today, George. How about tomorrow? Mm-hmm. And de Mohrenschildt said, fine. And they made a date. He gave Dreyer the instructions for how to get to the house where de Mohrenschildt was staying. Now, would George de Mohrenschildt have made a date for lunch the next day and then killed himself that same day, an hour after he made the date with Dreyer? It's inconceivable. Plus, of course, there were no shells for the gun that was found in the house there. There was no ammunition. Plus, Dreyer said the maid heard a car driving away shortly after the event. This has never been reported. I was amazed. I didn't realize when I went to interview Dreyer that he knew about how George de Mohrenschildt died.
Okay, our music indicates one of those hard breaks, but now we'll be back in a couple of minutes and more with Joan Mellen, the author of A Farewell to Justice, the Garrison investigation, the starting point for a serious overview of this topic. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. We're talking to Joan Mellen, the author of A Farewell to Justice. This is our interim wrap-up on the Kennedy 50th anniversary. I would just point out the attempt to send Oswald to Cuba looks like an attempt to sheep dip him, right? So that you'd have the possibility of blackmailing Cuba, right? Saying they did it. But concerning the CIA side, right? David Atlee Phillips, number one. How about James Jesus Angleton? Wasn't he the head of that program under which Oswald was sent to the Soviet Union?
That's right, Webster. So that's another CIA surfacing in this story, because certainly Oswald was not a Marxist. We don't have time to go into proving that, but we could easily do it. It was a program that James Angleton headed, a part of CIA counterintelligence, called False Defectors, entering the Soviet Union, and Russians saw through it instantly. And it was just really quite a farcical event, because Oswald tried to return his passport to an officer at the American consulate who was the CIA himself, Richard Snyder, and the documents have surfaced there. And another thing about Snyder, and I don't remember if we talked about this on an earlier program, Snyder denied that he ever had anything to do with CIA, but in fact he was CIA's recruiter at Harvard University, Harvard College, and one of the people that Snyder tried to recruit was Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now, whether or not Brzezinski was recruited, I don't know. The document trail stops there. But that Snyder found him an ideal recruit. There's no doubt. Those documents are available.
Now, since you bring this up, is this the same Snyder who then ended up as U.S. ambassador to the Philippines, I believe?
Did he? I don't think so.
I don't know.
But I can't be sure. Richard E. Snyder. No, Richard E. I don't know that for a fact.
All right.
I don't know.
Maybe Zbigniew was already working for somebody else. Anyway, I think we've covered the CIA. Now, you also make the case that he's an agent of the Customs, U.S. Customs.
Well, there's an interesting story. Oswald was seen in the company of officers of U.S. Customs and the Immigration and Naturalization Service in New Orleans, and this was one of the Immigration and Naturalization Service officers, whose name was Wendell Roche, was subpoenaed by the church committee, and he said, I've been waiting 12 years for somebody to talk to me, somebody to ask me about Oswald. So Roche went to testify to the church committee, and we have the summary of his testimony, but the transcript of the actual testimony, both of him and of David Smith of U.S. Customs, have vanished. And during the late 1990s, people who were working for the Assassination Records Review Board, ARRB, went and looked and saw what transcripts were still available that hadn't been released. And these customs and immigration testimonies had vanished. They're no longer there, and so we cannot expect to see them in 2017. The other witness who saw Oswald in the company of the customs officers was the owner of a bar called, I think it's called the Cabana Bar, named Orestes Pena. And we have a document showing that the files on Pena, even in Rome, as far away as Rome, were destroyed. And the church and HSCA testimonies of Pena have also been we're unable to locate them. So this was very sensitive. Certainly the government did not want Oswald to emerge as really a person utilized by several intelligence services working for the United States.
Let me ask you one more. Now, I've just been rereading Edward J. Epstein Inquest, and even in there, he has that the Warren Commission was certainly aware, or they had reports that Oswald was an FBI informant paid $200 a week or a month or whatever it was.
A month. But I think, yes, that's true, because it emerged in the executive sessions of the Warren Commission. They couldn't conceal it. And I have a lot of information in A Farewell to Justice about Oswald's relationship with the FBI in New Orleans. His handler was a person I found one of the most brilliant men I'd ever met. He was never the special agent in charge in New Orleans. His name was Warren DeBruys, and he certainly was Oswald's handler. Can you say his last name again, or maybe spell it for us? That's good. It's a Huguenot name, D-E, and then B-R-U-E-Y-S. And when I first minute I went in there, I said, how do you pronounce your name? Because nobody gets it right, except for people from Europe. And so he said, so that's why I'm confident in saying DeBruys. Mm-hmm. And he was a Huguenot, and his ancestry, actually told me, had fought Lord Nelson and some sea battles. So he's very proud of that. He's an extraordinarily charming, civilized, educated man. He was a lawyer. In those days, you had to be a lawyer usually to get into the FBI. And he was the person whom the FBI sent to Dallas on the day after the assassination to begin to compile a file on Lee Oswald. and Mr. DeBruze knew everything. And within a week, I think we had the 1,000 pages of commission documents, 75. All kinds of interviews with people in New Orleans, all kinds of information that they suddenly had on Lee H. Oswald.
But normally when you look into this FBI side, you get this character called Hosty, who's the one who
Hosty's in Dallas.
Hosty
is I'm sorry?
That Oswald had written them a note saying, stop harassing my family or I'll blow you up or something?
Oswald left the note, and then the FBI flushed it down the toilet. So that note has never appeared. But Hosty, yes, went to the house and was asking about Oswald. That was in Dallas just shortly before the assassination.
All right. Now, with all this wealth of material, I mean, we've done CIA, Customs, FBI. Is there any other agency that stands out? Because this is already a lot.
That's a lot. I don't know who else exists.
All right.
Now, of course, the Office of Naval Intelligence somewhere lurks here because Oswald was a Marine, which is part of the Navy. But I think really it was largely CIA. He was a CIA. And when you're with CIA, everyone else takes second place. I'm very interested in Colonel Edward Lansdale, who seems to be in the Air Force, and wore uniform, and was a military officer all his life, and yet, in fact, was CIA all his life. And we only know that because, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier either, we only know that because toward the end of his career, Lansdale wanted a promotion from his superiors at the Pentagon, supposedly, and they said no, they didn't think he was worthy of it, and then Allen Dulles wrote a letter to the Pentagon, and Lansdale became Brigadier General Lansdale as he retired. So we can see CIA there really using the military for cover and really in influencing the decision-making. But one of the things CIA wanted, whether it was State Department cover, military cover, corporate cover, and that is you have a complete cover. So your biography, if anybody looked into your file, you would be, for example, Lansdale, you'd have a complete military record with military numbers, and you would look on paper, surely, as if you were in the military. CIA was very careful about how the covers were organized.
And certainly the Lansdale is, I think, broadly, I mean, at least among the community researchers, this is the classic case of the CIA general. But now, moving on, you have just completed the round of all of these conferences, and I'll just tick them off at the beginning of the next segment. So what we're hoping to hear is the distilled wisdom or direction in the field that has come out of these events, since you're an eyewitness of all of them, really. So we'll be right back with Joan Mellen, author of A Farewell to Justice. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. It's our post-Thanksgiving broadcast, and we're wrapping up the developments on the Kennedy anniversary, the Kennedy assassination front, and we're talking to Joan Mellen. She's the author of A Farewell to Justice, Jim Garrison, JFK's assassination, and the case that should have changed history, which we highly recommend. Now, Joan has just attended the Cyril West conference. She's attended the Rider University Oliver Stone conference, the Lancers conference in Dallas, and the COPA conference. And I wonder, out of all of these presentations and events, if anything stands out that people need to be aware of.
Me, and it really did, because the media in all the coverage of the 50th anniversary almost never mentions Jim Garrison. But at every one of these conferences, Garrison was really the figure that stood out. It was amazing to me, not only particularly from Oliver Stone, because Oliver Stone was promoting his series, The Untold Unknown Histories, and didn't talk so much about Garrison. But on the day that I spoke, Mark Lane spoke first, and then I spoke. And then Bob Tannenbaum spoke, who was the deputy counsel for the House Select Committee, who left, of course, once CIA took over the investigation under Robert Blakey. But really, these to me, these were absolutely the high points. And everything else, as I look at it, really, you may be, I'm not saying this in a self-serving way, took second place. For example, at the WEC conference, the so-called keynote speaker was someone called Larry Sabato from University of Virginia. and he gave this speech about how the acoustic evidence was no good, and therefore the House, implying that the House Select Committee's conclusion that there was a conspiracy was in doubt. And this was, and everybody just sort of looked at each other. He was pathetic, and we knew we didn't know anything about the case. He didn't know, for example, that the questions about the acoustic evidence had been, sort of discussed and analyzed years and years ago. He pretended that this was something new. And this is what several people seem to have done, reviving old ideas and thinking and pretending that they're discovering something that had long been debunked. So that was the keynote there. I think that the CIA came to the forefront at all the other events, and I was when we had speeches about. We had some about George H.W. Bush, but that was also old stuff, nothing really new. And also, I have to say that one of the things that stands out in some of these conferences is people who steal the research of other people and don't give them credit look shameful. And I'm thinking about the George H.W. Bush material and the George de Mohrenschildt material that has come forth without proper credit being given to the person who wrote 11 volumes on George de Mohrenschildt, which is a writer named Bruce Adamson, who did extraordinary research, which I use myself in Our Man in Haiti, and which others have used. At least I gave Bruce credit in the text, not just in the notes. And I don't know. I think these conferences sort of exist also to keep people honest. So I was happy about that. I don't know. I think that on the Friday, I don't know when you're airing this program, but the day after Thanksgiving, C-SPAN 3 is going to air the second day of the WEC conference. And that's the day Mark Lane spoke, and I spoke, and Tannenbaum spoke, and Dan Alcorn, who's a Freedom of Information lawyer in Washington, led a panel. Rex Bradford was on it, who is the webmaster for the Mary Farrell site. And I think that was the best day, in my opinion. Sabato was the first day. And one of the things that happened the first day, I think this is another thing. People don't read other people's research. I had interviewed Dr. Robert McClelland for A Farewell to Justice, and he's the doctor who held President Kennedy's head and so could testify that the back of his head was blown out and the cerebellum fell out, and it was clearly had to be a shot from the front. Well, Dr. McClelland was interviewed in my book, and then they had a tape of sort of a video of Dr. McClelland at the WEC conference and presented it as if this were the first time that Dr. McClelland was talking. It wasn't. And now he talked to me and he talked to others over the years. He's always been open and honest, and has told us that when he went to the National Archives and looked at the x-rays and autopsy photographs that were there, he was appalled because he had been there holding President Kennedy's head and knew exactly what the wounds were and what happened. And so that occurred, and that was sort of nice to see Dr. McClelland on tape. But I had him in my book, and of course no one mentioned that, and so forth. And I don't know. I think that these conferences, they have their limitations, let's put it that way. And I think, but at Lancer, I was amazed to see in the people who came to the conference, so many questions about Jim Garrison, so much interest. And many people came from the UK. That was very unusual too. I'd never seen so many people, visitors, and also from Italy and from Puerto Rico and all sorts of people from many places. People from all over the country. That was really interesting. I suppose it was homage to the 50th anniversary, but it was really very, very special.
All right, so now we get to see you on C-SPAN 3 on Thanksgiving weekend. This program comes on Saturday, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon is the first broadcast. So people have plenty of time to tune to C-SPAN, and of course after it's broadcast on the C-SPAN, it'll be up on the C-SPAN video archive, where I hope that everybody who goes to look at my lecture on the Russian fleets will also then go on to look at this. So that's the Cyril West, and that's at a university? This is the
conference from Pittsburgh, from the the Forensic Science Institute that he runs, and that was sponsoring this conference. And of all the days, there were 3 days. I'm sorry?
It's a university, isn't it?
Duquesne University.
Duquesne,
that's right.
There we
it's
go.
Attached to Duquesne University.
All right. So Joan will be on C-SPAN 3 this post-Thanksgiving weekend. I also just wanted to point out the CNN 2-hour special, in the second hour, did show extensive clips of Mark Lane arguing, I think maybe with Walter Sheridan or somebody like this. Certainly they showed an ample cut of Garrison, I think indicting the CIA. They had Harold Weisberg. They had a number of other people. So I thought for CNN that was somewhat better than the norm.
Well, I didn't see it because I was still in Dallas, but I'm glad to hear that, because the first part of that, I gather, was all the pro-Oswald did it crowd of Bugliosi and Max Holland and Edward J. Epstein and that group.
Right.
So I don't think they had any current... I don't know. I didn't see it. But anyway, at least I'm glad to hear that they had Mark Lane, because Mark Lane has really been steadfast in his conclusion that CIA was behind the assassination. And at the WEC conference, someone in the audience asked Mark Lane, well, who was it? Who did the shooting? And Mark Lane said, I don't have evidence, and so I can't name the names. And, as a defense attorney, you don't accuse people unless you have the evidence, as far as individuals go.
But, of course, for a historian, it's not quite that way. So now we can say, and I would say as a historian, the CIA is the absolute prime suspect, and the whole thing is inconceivable without it. Now, just in order to get into that terrain, we have all these theories, right? Now, your mastery of this stuff is unparalleled. So I wanted to try to get you to give us a quick verdict on some of these theories, right? If you want to mention who brings them up, that's fine. If not, then not. What's the essence of the theory? And above all, if it's baloney, why is it baloney? How about this idea that Lyndon B. Johnson is somehow the mastermind of the Kennedy assassination?
Well, that's a great one that you mentioned, Webster, because it's the most prevalent one. And in the last decade, book after book, including the recent one by Roger Stone, insists that Lyndon Johnson was the mastermind of the Kennedy assassination, that a figure named Mac Wallace was his hitman and was seen in the sixth floor of the Texas School Book Depository shooting. And I'm very interested in that myself, because I'm just finishing a book about Mac Wallace. And I have to say that when you look at all those books, one thing they have in common is CIA is never mentioned at all.
Okay, 1 second now. We're going to get you to stay with us if we can. I think we have one more segment. We want to use that to try to round out the picture, and we'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. We're already in our final segment on our post-Thanksgiving show. We wanted to talk a little bit about poverty and also about the effects of something like the Obamacare in rural Kentucky, where you get a different view of this. But certainly Larry Sabato, and people in Virginia would, I think, say that his area is will McAuliffe defeat Cuccinelli or the opposite? That's his cup of tea. I don't see how he knows anything about the Kennedy assassination. But we're trying to run through these theories now. So the first one we wanted Joan to comment on is the LBJ.
Well, let me say this in general about all these theories, Webster, and that is CIA is really behind them. Whether in years past it was the mafia that they promoted, whether it was the KGB, which Richard Helms promoted that, and said that Garrison was really influenced by the KGB, and that's why he named Clay Shaw. Right. Whether it was Fidel Castro or whether it was Lyndon Johnson, all these, we get year after year a different sponsor. And one thing that these sponsors have in common is, false sponsors I should call them, they're not CIA. And it's very interesting to look at the Lyndon Johnson did it books and see that there's never a mention of Oswald in New Orleans. They have to rule that out. They have to rule out Clay Shaw, David Ferry, Oswald in the company of CIA people. They have to rule out everything in Louisiana in order to come up with this theory that Lyndon Johnson, his lawyer Ed Clark, and his right-hand man, now his name escapes me at the moment, Cliff Carter, were really the only people involved, and with Mac Wallace, that is, in creating the Kennedy assassination. That fact alone should let us know that this is false. It's absolutely false, and I reinvestigated the fingerprint evidence. Mac Wallace was supposedly up there on the sixth floor of the school book depository, and I had to hire a new certified latent print examiner, somebody who was an officer in the organization that does the certifying, to look at the prints of Mac Wallace when he was arrested once in Austin, his Navy prints from the U.S. Marines, which were pristine, and then an unidentified print in the hands of the Warren Commission, which we got a photograph of from the National Archives. And look at these prints. Was he really there? Does this print prove that Lyndon Johnson, so-called henchman, serial killer, was really up there? And so I'm not going to answer that right now, but you can guess where the discussion is going. But in past years, it was the mafia. And Robert Blakey, after the House Select Committee was finished, wrote a book with Richard Billings saying he found some mafia figures and they were behind it. It's inconceivable. Now, we know that CIA used mafia figures from the day that the CIA was created in Italy under Project Gladio, Operation Gladio, to subvert the elections, the post-war elections in Italy, and to be sure that the Christian Democrats won and that coalition of communists and socialists lost. We know that mafia have been useful and instrumental, but always under the command of CIA, never in the decision-making. So once that theory was sort of watered down, forget it, then we had to have Lyndon Johnson. That was the new one, and that one has been going. This book by Roger Stone is absurd. And yet here we have another one come out this past month or so saying these, and they never reinvestigate. They always repeat the same information as the previous book. Well, there's one by Phil Nelson. There was one called The Men on the Sixth Floor. All these Mac Wallace books say the same thing. They never bother to re-examine the information. I don't know whether it's just laziness, I guess.
The other thing that always strikes me as a student of the Wall Street banking establishment, such a decision is 10 or 20 pay grades above the presidency. That is, it's this naive notion that the president has real power, and that if something happens, the president must have done it. And this is the most elementary fallacy. So I certainly agree with you. And I would just point out this guy Tom Hartman is another book about
Hartman
mafia.
And Lamar Waldron and Hartman wrote a book called I can't remember, but it was a book about the mafia and Ultimate Sacrifice. Sorry, there it is, Ultimate Sacrifice, and that one. But then that went by the boards. But that book came out simultaneously with A Farewell to Justice. So you can see the CIA's met. They didn't. Many people ask me, "Well, did CIA hurt you? Did they kill you? Whatever? Did they try to kill you?" But what they do is they sponsor a book that says that the opposite of what you're saying, and I think CIA also had to have, and this is pure speculation, but they had to have sponsored Bugliosi's book, Reclaiming History, 1,000-page book published by W.W. Norton, and no big publisher these days publishes books of that length. And in that book, on the CD-ROM that's stuck on the side of it, is a vicious attack on me, and the leading libel lawyer in New York, Martin Garbus, who's actually a First Amendment guy, but he was willing to take the case and fight Bugliosi. The only thing is I couldn't afford it, so I had to let it go. We tried to raise the money, and he would have said he would have enjoyed fighting Bugliosi on the courtroom, but that didn't. But it was clearly libelous. They don't really care what they do. They have higher authority behind them, and that's why Clay Shaw, in the Garrison case, could sit there in court and lie and perjure himself, knowing that he would be protected. He would not go to jail, no matter what he did.
Right. So we have the well-known, I guess, Bugliosi, Posner, and then the favorite of Time magazine
guy.
is this McAdams, right? McAdams is the great hero of the Time magazine.
Well, McAdams, has been at it for years, attacking everybody who criticized the Warren Report. We know who was working for whom. Let's put it that way. And he was at the WEC conference, and I was trying to find him, because I wanted to say something to him, but he just didn't identify himself. So I couldn't figure out which particular individual he was. I think I did find him, and I said, "Are you John McAdams?" And he denied it. And I think that was McAdams. But there you go. He doesn't want to face us. He just and I saw the Time magazine reporter, and I was hoping in a naive egomaniac that I became, I thought, if only he would talk to me, I can tell my thoughts. And he didn't go anywhere near me.
And then
but I think
the Castro and Soviet KGB line. I've heard this described as a dialectical cover-up. In other words, there is something to it. That what you're doing is you're trying to build in a really extraneous elements, but they say, if you probe this, you may get World War III, right, for the first several years of it at least.
Well, Oswald was primed to be a person who was put up to it by Castro, and that's why Oswald was giving out Fair Play for Cuba leaflets in New Orleans in the streets in the summer of 1963, presenting himself as pro-Castro, and therefore on Castro's behalf, would be blamed for killing President Kennedy. But it didn't work out because it's inconceivable that Castro would kill President Kennedy. Plus, we learned that President Kennedy had sent various people to create a rapprochement with Castro. Now, right. Kennedy presented a contradictory policy. On the one hand, rapprochement. On the other hand, continuing to participate, especially with Robert Kennedy, in plots to assassinate Castro. But I think that the idea that because the Kennedys were involved in, and the CIA also was involved in plots to kill Castro, doesn't mean that Castro would then plot to kill President Kennedy. I mean, that's really absurd. Right. Just because somebody else does something doesn't mean you do. And I can't imagine that Castro would ever have done such a thing.
Now, in the limited time we have, the other one that seems to be getting some play now is the Israelis did it. Any comment?
Well, I heard that. Listen, Webster, I won't even listen to that. I was on a radio program and somebody said the Mossad was behind it. I said, what's the evidence? There's zero evidence for that. It looks like I'm anti-Zionist, but I still I see no evidence whatsoever for the Israelis getting involved in killing the American head of state. That's killing the cow that, what is the phrase?
The golden eggs.
Yeah. I wouldn't even grant that any credence whatsoever.
I would say, based on people from the CIA that I have known myself, the idea, whenever something bad happens, one of the standard CIA lines is, we would never do that. That must have been the Mossad. John, I'm afraid we don't have time for the world historical animate versions, but I think we've done a pretty good job in covering this. So we want to thank you, and we want to recommend that everybody get A Farewell to Justice, Jim Garrison, the JFK Assassination, in the case that should have changed history, by Joan Mellen, Potomac Books. And thank you very much.
No, Skyhorse. The new edition is Skyhorse Publishing.
Skyhorse Publishing. Well, then that's the one. Get the new one with the extra 90 pages based on the last 20 years of documents. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Webster.
Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving to all, and we'll be back next week on World Crisis Radio.
And because we don't have that piece, I urge everyone to read Don DeLillo's novel Libra, where DeLillo postulates that among the planners, he has one fictional planner, and he has one person that is a spitting image of David Atlee Phillips, who was in the clandestine services, and whose name appears beginning with, I suppose, the coup in 1954 in Guatemala. So there's a history of CIA overthrows of elected officials, and the same people then turn to what they call the CIA's executive action capability, and they turn it on our own president and the head of state here. I don't think there's any other sponsor of the assassination more obviously connected than CIA, and of course they're involved in the cover-up. And
how did this come about? Who did it? In other words, who's the culprit, as best we can tell?
Well, it's a pleasure to hear you again, Webster. I don't know where to start. We really start with Jim Garrison, because when Jim Garrison looked at Oswald in New Orleans and he saw with whom Oswald was associating, he said not only, I think I might have said this on the last program, not only was Oswald not a lone assassin, as the Warren report said, but everyone he was with CIA. More recently, a person who had been, I guess you could call it, involved with a CIA proprietary, said to me that it was a certainty that CIA had foreknowledge of the Kennedy assassination. And that's as far as he would go. So I don't think we can say who was the person whose bright idea this was.
We are delighted and honored to be joined once again by Professor Joan Mellen of Temple University in Philadelphia. And she, of course, is the author of this landmark study, A Farewell to Justice, and the second edition with 90 pages, I believe, of additional material has appeared and is available. And I would urge people to make this your starting point, or at least a key point of reference in any study you want to do of the Kennedy assassination and related problems. Because as a historian, I would always say the best bet for getting a good analysis of anything is a historical presentation, a genetic history. And here, through her experience.
And they're really everywhere. When the House Select Committee did its investigation, CIA was looking over their shoulders and informing the committee and the lawyers for the committee what questions they were allowed to ask witnesses and what and what time period they were allowed to cover. And when Gaten Fonzie, who was the chief investigator for the House Select Committee, sat there watching the Bernardo de Torres being deposed, he said to himself, of all the hundreds of thousands of Cubans you would in Florida, you would never have thought why the House Select Committee chose this guy. So heavily sanitized was the interview. Bernardo de Torres, I'll just remind the listeners, was one of the people, the two Cubans who visited Sylvia Odio in September.
It's an analysis of the Garrison investigation. You get how this problem unfolded itself before the eyes of the world. So, again, very happy to be joined by Joan Mellen. Now, Joan is just back from Dallas, and we want to get her to talk about that. But now, Joan, the one thing after all the stuff we saw, right, there was a CNN special, there were a million specials, CBS had their 4 days of coverage on their website, C-SPAN had days of NBC coverage on C-SPAN. Ultimately, who did this? And as you have said in many appearances, it's the CIA, it's specifically the operations directorate of the CIA. Can you, just as a starting point, a benchmark, to lay down